My name is Bob Quinn. I'm third generation on this farm, Wheaton cattle rancher. This farm was started by my grandfather in 1920, and so next year we'll celebrate 100-year anniversary. I was raised here, as was my father, and my children were raised here. I went to school, local schools in Big Sandy, to Montana State University for college, studying botany and plant pathology. My passion are plants and science, and so I wanted to combine those two, and then I went on for a PhD to UC Davis in California. And after 10 years of university, I was a little disillusioned with the whole university scene, so I came back to the farm, and now my whole farm is my laboratory and my garden. And these stakes are for potatoes that were just planted 2 days ago. I have 5 different varieties. I started with 42 varieties to see what would do best in dry land, and I'm down to 5 that really do well in dry land.
Now you quickly went past those degrees. Technically, you have you have 3 degrees. You have PhD.
Yes.
But they're mostly plant around.
Yes, the plant biochemistry was my PhD, and my undergraduate bachelor's degree was in botany, and my master's is in plant pathology.
So you understand the science and the technical end of plants, as well as the innate farming history that you have in your blood.
Well, I have a passion for plants, a real feel for plants, but I also love to study them on a scientific basis. So I know a lot. I don't know everything, of course, about them, but I know how they function and their parts and their cycles and how important they are to us and how they integrate with the rest of the environment.
And you're actually doing a little bit of manipulation, and I wouldn't say manipulation, but you're studying how plants grow differently in different environments. You do some experiments here on the farm. Tell us about that.
I'm always pushing the edges because I think that's where you learn. If we just stick in the secure middle, we don't learn very much. And for me, the exciting things are trying what's new. We have a peach tree in my orchard, and it doesn't last but 2 or 3 years. But when I was a kid, we never dreamed of such a thing. The climate change has made some of this necessary, but also has allowed for some experimentations that would have just been dreams a few years ago. When I was a kid, I grew watermelons every year in my garden. At least I planted them. I never got anything bigger than a softball, and they never were ripe, and they never were any good. But I loved watermelon. I never gave up trying. And after I was gone for 10 years and back here for another 10 or 15, I decided to try some watermelon again, and about 15 years ago. And it was 23 pounds. And it's delicious.
Same land.
Yes, same farm. And this is in my garden. And now I've experimented to the point where we're trying them in dry land, out in the field, and planting them without any extra water, just early in the spring as we can, with avoiding the frost, and letting them just grow and giving them lots of room and no competition with weeds. And they're producing fabulous watermelons and cantaloupes and other types of melon that we never would have imagined. I would have never imagined you could grow dry land before. So those are kind of experiments, Eli, that I've really been having fun with, doing dry land vegetables that we know the pioneers and the homesteaders did, because they had no refrigeration. They had no freezer trucks that came in from California. They had none of that. And so whatever they ate, they had to grow. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to grow what I eat and eat what I grow.
Now, you've said a couple of times, and this is a new term that I've learned up here, that, I mean, I've heard it, but I don't really understand it. Explain the difference to the layperson between dryland farming and what regular farming that other people might associate with.
Well, dryland farming is peculiar to the West, but the Intermountain West, the Great Plains, where we're out of the Ogallala, where we don't have water to pump out of the ground. Our soil or groundwater is quite alkaline and full of sodium, so it'll ruin the soil if we irrigate with it. The rivers are few and far between compared to the land mass, and so we've had to learn to farm in this area at least on 12 to 14 inches of rainfall. That's about 1/3 of what you'd get in Iowa, Ohio, Illinois, going further east in the Midwest. And they can grow, of course, corn and things that much more abundance than we can grow here. We grow small grains. Corn is a large grain, for example. And by the time you get to the middle of the Dakotas, coming west, you're into the shortgrass prairie. And so shortgrass prairie is dryland. And it's the semi-arid. That's the next thing to the desert. Now, by the time you get to the desert, then you really do need to irrigate if you're going to have any crops of substantial measure at all. And that's, of course, very common in Arizona and through Central Valley, California, and Southern California, that sort of thing. That's really getting close. And sometimes it is desert. In other areas, it's just close to desert. And we're somewhere in between that. And so we have enough rain. 12 and 14 inches gives us nice crops if we grow only every other year. So we grow our cash crop 1 year, and then when we follow the ground, which means that we don't grow a crop on it the second year. And we're saving water during that second year. Traditionally, that fallow ground was tilled to keep the weeds down. In the last couple of decades, the stubble is left standing, and people, instead of tilling, are spraying with glyphosate and Roundup. That's why we have glyphosate contamination everywhere. There's 4.5 billion pounds of glyphosate used, and in our area, most of that use is not on GMO crops or Roundup Ready, because there's no Roundup Ready wheat, but it's used 3 or 4 times a year on most of the chem fallow ground, which is the majority of the fields now.
Wow.
In organic systems, which is what we've been doing the last 30 years, we are growing a green manure cover crop that adds mostly legumes that add nitrogen and feed the soil on that fallow year. And we terminate those crops by early June or mid-June at the latest, so that we conserve water then from mid-June to the rest of the summer. And we found that compared to black fallow, where you're cultivating, we can raise a crop of nitrogen or soil feeding material that we work into the ground and have the same water conservation at the end of the season as the black fallow has. We don't have quite as much water as the standing stubble the no-till people have, and I've been experimenting for years trying to figure out no-till organic systems and really haven't been successful yet, but it's just a matter of time till we can get it figured out, and resources. So that's really the difference. The difference is that we can only grow 1 crop in 2 years, and where they have plenty of water, sometimes they can grow 2 or 3 crops in 1 year. So that's a huge, huge difference. And the land values represent that too.
But you don't irrigate, you don't put piping out. You basically go with what the land gives you in a way, it seems like.
Yeah, and what the heavens send as far as rainfall.
Yes. Now, you just talked about cover crops, and I've done a little bit of research on it. I'm not a farmer, but they do smother the weeds in a way, because the plants that you plant, vetch or winter wheat or whatever it happens to be, will smother the weeds and add nitrogen to the soil. They're nitrogen fixing plants, so you get that benefit. But they also add organic material to the ground, and that's
carbon.
That's carbon fixing. Now, that's the one thing that the average person probably understands, is the term carbon sequestration, or has heard of that. So tell me how what you're doing actually helps the environment when it's helping you.
Well, actually, agriculture has both the seeds of the problem of climate change, because of the great reliance on particularly chemical fertilizers, which put an enormous amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's made with petroleum products and gas and high temperatures. But also, on the other side of the spectrum, it holds in its hands also the solution. So we're, on the one extreme, creating part of the problem, and on the other side, we have part of the solution right in our hands, because with organic systems and regenerative organic systems, which is the only kind that really is sustainable, we are putting back that carbon from the atmosphere, fixing in plants, like you say, which are then tilled into the ground or let to lie on top of the ground as mulch and eventually go into the soil. And they feed the soil and adding carbon, increasing the carbon-based and organic matter of that soil. So there's if the whole world were to go organic and do regenerative organic agriculture, there would be enough carbon taken out of the atmosphere to almost reverse what we've done up to this point. It doesn't mean now we can keep going with the way we're keep putting carbon into the atmosphere, but we could use it as a step back, as a kind of a reset on our clock, and then use some more practical or imaginative ways to reduce the emissions in the future. Because that's really only a one-time event. I mean, you go back to a certain level of putting carbon in the soil, and then everything is kind of static. It's turning over then. It's both going out and coming in. But now the soils are, by and large, so diminished with carbon that it really offers a huge bank or sink that could be utilized.
No, you served us a delicious lunch. And
thank you.
That was absolutely wonderful. But over lunch, we talked about something that I was really fascinated by because it didn't really occur to me. You've talked about regenerative agriculture not being part of our normal history here so far in this country, how westward expansion and our parents and grandparents moved across and how they impacted the land and then left. Could you talk about that again in its entirety?
Well, that didn't happen to everybody, of course, but particularly in the South where the ground was used for cotton and tobacco, by and large, those are very heavy feeders, and if the ground, the soil is not replenished, it will wear out very, very fast. And even some of the pioneers and forefathers of the country, like Jefferson and Washington, they already understood this, but they were the minority. A lot of the farmers would just come and farm the land, use up the soil or the nutrition of the soil, and then they would move west. My family's, on my dad's side at least, started in Pennsylvania, moved to Ohio, moved to Iowa, moved to Washington State, and back to well, and some of them moved to Nebraska, and they switched over to Alberta. Some moved back to Idaho, and then ended up in Montana. So they're going mostly west and a little bit back east from the extreme. But two things were going on. Either the kids were not the oldest and they weren't inheriting the farm, or the farm was becoming less productive. And we were just starting in this area to reach the point where the soils were being depleted of their natural nutrition and viability. And there were some experiments just beginning about the time of World War II for replenishing that with cover crops and with legumes and different rotations. There wasn't very much that they saw in the 30s and in the 40s. They didn't really see big differences because the ground still had a fair amount of nutrition in it. But some of the people in the East had started to see this. But when the chemicals came in as a artificial replacement to nutrition in the soil, and they started focusing on feeding the plants instead of feeding the soil, it's quite a different perspective. They had some instant success with that. And so then the focus turned away from feeding the soil just to feeding the plants. And we still had soil degradation. And the Dust Bowl was part of that. The Dust Bowl was caused by a lot of the fallowing that I told you about. That's not done in plowing. We never plow here. We don't use the plow. We use cultivators, which disturb the ground much less, but we don't turn it over like a plow does and expose all of that soil to the wind. We can't afford to do that. It'll blow away for sure the first year. So we are using the stubble and the the material that's growing on top of the ground and incorporate it just in the first couple inches. And so there's a lot of material on top of the ground and then just right below the surface that's holding the soil together. And that's what we try to do to conserve the soil and keep it from eroding.
And if you use cover crops and things like that, they probably have a tendency to help bind the soil together.
That's even
as well,
more. That even gives you much more advantage, because then you're actually feeding the soil in those off years. Because if you just grow a grain crop and say that summer fall is your rotation, well, that's a pretty poor rotation. It's really not adding very much to the soil. Because you're hauling off a certain amount from that grain crop, and you're not putting much in, not putting extra back. with cover crop, you actually replenish the soil. You're putting more in it. You're regenerating. That's regenerative organic agriculture. The term comes from.
Now, when you have the crops that you put in and the fallow land next to it, it's in big strips, correct? Would you describe the strips that you have? And so you're not really laying a whole field. You're not letting a whole field go to rest. You're sort of doing it in strips. Is that correct, or is it both?
When my father, in response to the Dust Bowl, that was very, very common, is to do very narrow strips so we could reduce wind and water erosion. Now with chem fallow, which is reducing erosion, with conservation tillage is what we practice, which is reduced tillage and no plowing. We have less erosion on bigger parcels, and with bigger and bigger machinery, people are going away from this area, at least, away from the narrow strips and going to bigger blocks. But still, the trade-off is always we don't want so big of a block. We want to treat that block in a way that it won't blow away. That's the key. The strips helped us with that, with poor or less imaginative cropping systems. But as we got more complex cropping systems and adding cover crops and green manures, we don't have to have those narrow strips to be successful.
Now you do quite a bit of crop rotation too, correct?
Oh yeah, so organic agriculture is built on two main principles. One's diversity, and so you look out in the prairie, you don't see any monoculture. You see great diversity. In the forest, you see diversity. And along the seashore, you see diversity. In the streams and the rivers, everywhere you look in nature, you see great diversity. There's no monoculture. And when you have monoculture, it's an artificial system. That means you have to have artificial means to sustain it. And that means, in this day and age, that means industrial chemical agriculture. We're trying to switch away from that because we think that has a lot of high costs. And you don't pay most of them at the checkout stand at the food counter. Well, we pay them, well, we'll talk about that later maybe. We'll pay them way down the road, either pollutions or illness or whatever. But in going to regenerative agriculture, we really need to mimic nature. And so the diversity we see in nature, we mimic with crop rotations. And that's one way to do it. And also rotations then break up disease cycles, pest cycles, insect cycles, all of those things are allowed to allow us to grow crops without the use of chemicals and yet not have those crops taken over by weeds or insects or disease. Those are the three things. And if you break up those cycles by not growing the same crop in the same field year after year, you have much better opportunity to be successful. Our goal is not to eliminate all those things to zero. We don't eradicate any of that stuff. It's all part of the circle of life, you might say, but we do try to manage it so it doesn't become an economic deterrent or economic problem to our cash crops. And that's the one principle. And the second principle is soil building. So we have to have some of those crops in our rotation that help build the soil, that are adding back nutrients to the soil rather than just taking it out. If you're just taking nutrients out, you're no different than the mine in mining. And the trouble with that is that every mine has a bottom, and every soil will have a bottom in terms of losing all of its nutrition. Then it's it's not very good for growing crops and nutrition and growing nutritious food and plants.
I would say that you're describing dead soil, and you had a great parallel for me, the difference between dirt and soil.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about glyphosate, I think, maybe then. And glyphosate actually not only is a weed killer, but it's an antibiotic. And so the more you spray, I tell people when I'm doing my book tour lectures, I said, the more glyphosate you spray, the deader is your dirt. So if you want really dead dirt, then just keep spraying glyphosate. But if you want living soil that's vibrant and alive and can produce healthy plants, because healthy soil produces healthy plants, then you need to look at some of the things we just got done talking about. The rotations and the soil building components. And then healthy plants, of course, produce healthy food, which is producing healthy people or animals, whoever's eating that. And that's our goal. That should be our goal. Not just cheap and abundant food, but nutritious food. And we don't have to worry about sacrificing enough food for people to eat. I mean, we waste almost 50% of the food that's grown on the whole earth. If we just looked at that question, we could cut our food costs. In Western society, most of that waste comes after we buy at the grocery store or including the grocery store. We could cut our grocery bill in half by not wasting anything in the West. In underdeveloped countries, most of that waste comes because it's not adequately protected getting to the grocery store. So they don't have storage and transportation to keep the rain out or the bugs out or the rats or all that kind of stuff. That's where almost half of theirs is lost. But over the whole earth, almost half of the food is lost. Between 40 and 50%. It's enormous. So that's some of the things that could also be addressed that we're not really addressing.
Now, in all of this, in life we try to pigeonhole things.
Yeah,
and as I'm listening, I'm trying to figure out where to place you. At lunch, I was thinking that too. He kind of sounds a little bit like a tree hugger. I can classify myself as a tree hugger, so I get that. But I also hear the business in you. I don't really hear you proselytizing about well, you need to be organic because it's the right thing to do. It sounds like it's just a sensible decision to you from a business perspective, an economic perspective, and a long-term, sort of a long-term monetary perspective. We talked about health impacts and things like that. Mm-hmm. Do you view it as that? Because it seems like you're just a businessman here, and organics and regenerating the soil is just a smart decision. Is that true?
To me, it all goes together. It's all linked, and we can't have any of this whole program isn't independent. It doesn't stand independent by itself. We are growing food for people to eat. Most of my neighbors are thinking about growing commodities, as though they go into the commodity market and they're done with it, and that's it. It's just gone. We are linked to the people that actually eat what we grow, if we think about it that way. That really changes the perception of what we're doing. We're not just trying to make money growing commodities. I mean, we have to make enough money to be here next year. So that's why it's a business, and it has to be profitable enough to survive and to progress and to feed our family. That's our goal. My goal wasn't to go to town and get another job or send my wife to town to work to support my farming habit. You know, I felt like we need to add value to what we're doing here in the farm to allow us to be successful financially. But what we're doing is growing food. We're not growing commodities. And so that brings me now to the point of, well, how do you grow healthy food? You grow healthy food by having healthy plants. Well, how do you get healthy plants? You get healthy plants by having healthy soil. Well, where do you get healthy soil from? Well, you feed it and you take care of it, you nourish it, and you don't abuse it. And you don't spray it with a bunch of chemicals that kills everything. So to me, all of that is all linked together. And if it's done right, it can be successful on all those levels, not only nutritionally and health-wise, but also financially and also supporting the community. So all those things are linked, and not abusing our planet, not polluting it, and having dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico that are the size of New Jersey. How big do they need to get before we think we have a problem? We're going in the wrong direction. And the people that are making the most money about this have the most power and the most influence in Washington and don't want to see anything changed. And they're extracting the wealth from middle America, from agriculture, and putting it in their own pockets. This multinational chemical industrial complex is what I call them.
So next week you're going to Washington to try and work on this. Tell me about that.
I am. So we're going to talk about that. So I have a new slogan, and I'm having buttons made, and it's going to say "chemical free by 43." And
that's rather ambitious, is it not?
Well, it is. But some of my friends don't even think we have that long, because of the way soils are deteriorating and health is deteriorating, and cancer and autism is skyrocketing, diabetes. I heard a report the other day that said right now, in the 70s, autism affected, I think, 1 in 5,000 or something. It was very rare. I never saw anybody with autism as I was growing up. Now it's down to 1 in 37. In Big Sandy, my little hometown here, we have about 70 in the grade school. We have 2 autistic kids. It's right at the national average. We never saw that. And people say, oh, well, we just didn't diagnose it. Well, if you've seen autistic kids, you don't miss that kind of diagnosis. They don't talk. They bang their head against the wall. That's not something you're going to miss in diagnosis. That's laughable. And the way the current trends is on that, they're talking about 1 in 3 by 20, 35 or 40 or something. That will break the country. I mean, it's not only it's a tragedy for the families that deal with that, but also the cost of dealing with this kind of a problem with the children is enormous. And we can't have that kind of increase in those kind of diseases and not pay a huge price. It'll bring the whole country to a halt. And this is the kind of thing that I'm always trying to connect food and health and food and nutrition. And if we can do that, then we can start thinking about appreciating adding more value to that food and making it more nutritious and more healthy, and thereby paying more for it because it's worth more. Because how do you put a price on an autistic kid not being autistic? You know, if it's as simple as, you know, glyphosate contamination or something like that. That is huge. And so those are some of the kinds of things that I like to rattle the cages about.
And it's the positive and the negative direction, correct? I mean, if our food has an apple, I've heard the statistics is 22% less vitamin A than an apple 50 years ago because we've changed it so much. So you're paying more for the apple. It's the same size apple, but you're not getting as much of what you're paying for. So food, it can have negative impacts with things like the autism and other conditions that occur, but it can also have a lack of positive impacts, which might be the same thing, less nutrition in the food that we get. And it's all dependent upon how we raise our food, is it not?
It's dependent on 3 main things that I tell people. And for wheat, I'd say 4, but 2 of them really go together. So it depends, first of all, the seed that you use. Are you using a seed that's been bred for the sole purpose of producing gigantic yields? If you are, you're probably using a seed that's lost some nutritional value along the way. And what we need is better ways to test that more easily. We've seen that in some of the experiments that we've done, some of the research we've done in Italy, but they cost millions of dollars. And we need a quick test to know that when we do a cross by plant breeders, and they're looking, yield is fairly easy to measure, but it's not so easy to measure all these nutritional things. If we had an easy way to measure nutrition, then we should be using that as just as important and maybe even more important criteria for plant selection than yields. So that's one thing that's gone in the wrong direction. The other thing that's gone in the wrong direction, I've already talked about and mentioned, is industrial agriculture. We need to go back to regenerative organic agriculture, or go forward to it, maybe I should say, because now we know better how to do it. And that will produce healthier, more nutritious plants and more nutritious food. So that's the second thing. The third thing we've done, particularly in talking about wheat, because that's what I know best, is the processing. So we've made white flour. That's not anything new, except when you're looking at the last 10,000 years, then it's really new. And so is the chemical agriculture. You know, when people talk about conventional agriculture, they mean chemical agriculture. That's not conventional. What's conventional is what we've been doing for the last 10,000 years. That's conventional. What this experiment we're doing for the last 70 years, that's an experiment. That's a chemical experiment. And my prediction is that experiment will come to an end. And we'll look back at this period in as much awe as we look back to when we used DDT freely like water, like it was benign. And yet we found later that it wasn't benign. And I think we'll find the same thing. We'll come to the same conclusion eventually with all these wonderful better life through chemistry ideas. And we'll go back and go forward at the same time using better technology, but back to original principles of conventional agriculture, which really was based on rotations and feeding the soil and producing more nutritious food.
That's really interesting because commercial and conventional agriculture are often thought of as the same. In my mind, I kind of thought of it not as the same thing, but connected. And they are 2 different things, but 70 years, you're right. I mean, that's really only the period of time.
It's a lifetime. I mean, I'm 70 now. It's been my lifetime. I was born in 47. Chemical agriculture was just being introduced after World War II. That's when I was born. In my lifetime, people my age don't know anything different than that. And yet they call that conventional. And that's a paradox.